It's an honour to be here. We're a very modest venture capital investor, which is probably not a sort of frequently seen beast in a room like this or at a conference like this. So I suppose the aim from our perspective today is to show what the plight of an investor who's put soil at the centre of their climate thesis is in terms of trying to get more capital into this space, and potentially how that links to innovation and how that links to academia. It's an uphill battle, I suppose, is the basic point. Our three pillars very clearly, and I'm repeating what you already know, but if we can build soil, we can hold water in the landscape, we can slow a water cycle, we can restore rain, we can restore weather. Second pillar is biodiversity, which doesn't need a huge amount of explanation, and the third piece is clearly nutrition. Healthy soil equals healthy food. How do we get these pennies to drop is the experience that I will try and briefly run you through. Bear in mind, this deck is put together to convince other investors, not necessarily academics. So I'll be showing you through the ways that we try and talk and educate a climate VC whose knowledge on this subject is usually very thin. And through that explain the frustrations that we see. But we begin with just the market size. Now, clearly this is a Chatham House stat. It's, we would argue, many times more than this, considering we eat 3 times a day and our health is entirely reliant on what we eat as much as the oxygen that we breathe. Just the devastation of the problem, the scale of it. I mean, you can look at any stats on this, 87% of species in UK rivers being nobbled as a good local one. I won't bore you with the problem in all its detail because you know it all already, but things like Tim Lang's stat at the bottom there, the idea that the UK in the whole of Europe still has the highest percentage of severely food insecure households for children under the age of 16 is a phenomenal fact that, as a confluence of all those above it, should be used to try and get the investment community to realise, A, the extent of the problem, and then, as I hope to show, the extent of the financial opportunity if we can get into the new science that's turning this farm to fork spectrum upside down. So this has been touched on today. The health crisis is a soil crisis. Why do we need soil? Well, we need the full spectrum of nutrients that we very finely evolved over the course of our evolution to run our bodily processes properly. And at the moment, the food that is majoritively being eaten is from soils that is lacking on that spectrum. So unfortunately, conventional agricultural practices unravel these vital partnerships and thereby undercut our well-being. Tim Benton, I don't know if any of you know Tim Benton, but on food systems, he's completely brilliant. He's just talking about the urgency of the transformation for our food systems now, and the nature and gravity of the challenges linking agriculture and food value chains to diets, health, and planetary ecosystems can no longer be ignored. Now, we talk about technology and we talk about revolutions, and whether it's the agricultural revolution being led by the plough or the industrial being led by the loom or the technical being led by the silicon chip, the role of technology is a massive lever. It is only part of it, but it is a huge deliverer of change. And at the moment, it's being vastly ignored in favour of other sectors that I'll get onto. Worth also mentioning that nature, food and farming are deeply undigitalised. And so how can we bring data that can be the vehicle for transformation to become more pervasive? Again, this is just spelling it out for the investor. The thriving investors of tomorrow will be those who move early to develop solutions for a net zero, nature positive, resilient food system. It's amazing looking at the venture dollar. Before we go there, you'll know all these slides. This is just looking at the scale of the issue, the heat that we're seeing at the moment, which is obviously getting to a point that even most investors don't understand is as critical as that. Tim Benton likes to talk about the interconnectedness of our food system. So just the UK, and obviously this is hideously simplified, and you've spoken about it in detail, I'm sure, today. But whether it's our corn, our coffee, our cocoa supply chains, the commodity pieces of our very entrenched and interconnected. This looks at, I suppose, the 5 major ports where commodity food is shifted through. And just, if we're only ever 7 meals away from all-out revolt, then the 5 major ports of Panama, Suez, Hormuz, Malacca, there are issues, and the Black Sea ports, there are obvious issues, whether to do with war, famine, weather, affecting all of those. And our just-in-time food supply chain might look a little bit more fractious than most people realize. I won't go into this too much because I think the breakdown of the negative externalities of our UK food system is something that has probably been discussed today in more detail. But getting people to understand the extent of the human health piece and the environmental piece, which we would argue again is massively undervalued there, and the biodiversity piece is interesting. The Sustainable Food Trust are worth following in terms of understanding what a future food system might look like. And this, in reference to, what you were discussing earlier, looks at what a rebalancing of a British food system might look like, which really is an increase in fruit and veg and a big pullback in poultry and dairy to rebalance. This is looking sectorally at where we are in terms of digitalization. It's a pretty crude slide, but what we're trying to show is that soils, agriculture, farm, biosystems are tremendously undigitalized. And how do we make this happen using technology to allow us to be able to transition with more speed? It's the basic premise. I think talking about the fragility, the nutritional gaps, the vulnerability to disruption, the environmental degradation has been well covered today. And I think the how do we fix this piece we'll get onto in more detail. Now, I won't go into this in huge detail, but just to re-explain, when talking to a climate investor and the importance of positioning soil more centrally within that, with the 3 pillars underneath soil being, in our eyes, restoration of climate via water cycles, biodiversity and habitat increase being the second, and the third being nutrition, are the pieces we go on to try and explain. And here we pick out, as the sort of penny drop moments, water cycles and nutrition. If anyone is interested, this is a sort of wonderfully clear book, really giving substance to the idea that your food is only as nutritious as the soil that it's come from. Trying to get investors to understand the need for micronutrients, phytochemicals, what good fats look like, what secondary metabolites look like at the root stem of the plants that are within healthy soils versus those that aren't. How bodily processes rely on these range of phytochemicals. Good health starts on the farm, with healthy soil leading to healthy crops and livestock, and ultimately us. Can farmers produce enough nutrient-dense food to feed us all? Can we have quality? Can we have quantity? How does technology get involved? Second strain of this, and this is before I go into the tech bit, which I'll be fairly brief with, is looking at the carbon myopia that our space has suffered from. What's interesting here is it's trying to group together the various pieces of nature restoration that we look at, and they've completely ignored nutrition in itself anyway. So illustrating the extent of our plight. We can cool the planet by storing water by building life in the soil. We keep water in the landscape, which increases the ability to photosynthesize, and therefore energy flows from the sun. Water cycles, carbon's hydrophilic, and healthy soils can keep up to 8 times more water in the landscape, which increases transpiration and therefore cloud cover. We'll go on to briefly explain that. Mineralization from roots and the biodiversity above ground. A restoration of a water cycle, just the importance of trying to get investors to understand what this involves, whether a small water cycle on half an acre in terms of building life in your soil, keeping it covered, ideally bring livestock back onto it, having sensible rotations, through to continent-wide water cycle restoration, which is the answer to our climate crisis in terms of cloud cover and rain patterns. We also try and explain a little bit about organic aerosols versus inorganic aerosols and what they can do for rain formation. Again, I won't go into the detail of this, but the opportunity is big. The amount needed to spend on this food system, we would argue, is many multiples of the 300 billion annually. And likewise, what the food systems will contribute. This is beginning to drop. Moving on to the consumer, they're at the beginning of their education bell curve. As the facts sink in around nutrition, we expect accelerated adoption of healthy food. The stat that is vaguely interesting is 678,000 Americans die annually from chronic diet-related illness, which is more than any American in any war, in all wars since independence. If that fact was more clearly understood, there would be a lot more public outcry. So how does the adoption of the educational bell curve increase? Change is happening. Again, this is a pretty crude slide, but you get the idea. No one would have expected the uptake of alt milks, as much as we might disagree with a lot of them. We don't think that the way oats are sprayed off with glyphosate before harvested, or necessarily the omega-6 to 3 ratios, or the glycemic spikes that one can experience from oat milk is a good thing. But there was a rapid shift, and the consumer is becoming a meaningful entity now in terms of pushing innovation and pushing technology adoption. Clarkson's farm outviewing Top Gear in America. I mean, whether we like Clarkson or not, the awareness around this space is big. How he links soil to nutrition is something that we are in constant conversation with him and his team about to try and get him to increase, because it is a massive lever, especially for the youth of today. Waitrose, the supermarkets have been pretty slow on regeneration. In our eyes, this was a pledge that came out last year, meat and dairy to be entirely regenerative by 2030. We're expecting a supermarket to really jump on it this year. I think Chris Van Tulleken, you hopefully witnessed him earlier, but who are the talisman of this space going to be in terms of the media, in terms of pushing bills through government, in terms of working with big corporates to get things moving quickly? I don't know if you can watch this, but in a sense, it's irrelevant. Essentially, it's Eric Cartman, that great barometer of social zeitgeist, ringing up a sort of the USDA, which is sort of positioned like a NASA in this thing, saying that he's solved the problem, turned the food pyramid upside down so that you have fats and oils and meats at the top and grains at the bottom. We won't go into this, but it's looking at the corporate pledging that's going on, and things like Walmart looking at restoring at least 50 million acres of land by 2030. This is an old pledge. It's frankly fundamentally impossible for him to do it. It's frankly pretty impossible for them to get going with as aggressively as they're saying. However, the proliferation of these pledges is increasing. The greenwashing within is ever present, but now that the data is beginning to flow, it's getting harder and harder for big corporates to hide behind empty pledges. Tech investors, we understand their role in accelerating systems change. So the average tech investor is there to claim that they will invest in a company that will push a systems change. However, when it comes to climate tech, institutional investors, how do we get them to prioritize soil health and sustainable nutrition? This is the big question. By educating them and making sure that soil is climate, soil is nutrition, soil is resilient. It's not just a farming issue. Have I got a minute? Yeah. To support sustainable food systems transformation at pace, the finance sector must scale solutions that ease access to capital. So our issue at the moment is that people look at this sector and they go, it's ag tech, which has yearly investment cycles or yearly cycles. It's laden in debt, it's hardware, it's capex heavy. It's not a community with an appetite for change, etc. Haven't been many unicorns. And what we're trying to prove is that it's climate, it's health. It's very much not just on farm. The point is, the current total climate finance investment per year. This is outdated and old, but it's still tiny versus what's needed. And within that, in terms of looking at true regeneration for proper nutrition in this sense, it's way, way under. Farm to flush, if you look at our understanding of that whole value chain and how much science has rushed in to turn it on its head, we've still only taxonomized 1% of what's in our soils, with very little understanding really as to how it functions over the course of a day, a week, a month, a year, let alone with whatever's in it in conjunction. But these frontier markets are creating a huge amount of opportunity for investors, and the amount of technology that we're coming in to solve for this is really breathtaking. So the need for focused investors to take these early stage companies up through their life cycle such that larger institutions can come and invest is where we try and sit. The confluence of tailwinds in terms of input costs making it hard for farmers and therefore them having to look elsewhere. The various regulatory pieces in terms of the nature disclosures, BNG, or having to account for one's own footprint, really making it a time of absolute revolution on farm. Climate tech versus tech. So within climate tech, which is a screen piece, which is obviously tiny in comparison, what we would term truly regenerative tech would be a very, very small percentage of that. This is climate VC funding by sector, transport, energy, food and land use, all protein. Now, we would argue that a large majority of all protein is only going to be as good as the media that it's fed, so it's not going to have the full spectrum of nutrition that we've evolved to need. Indoor farming, very similar, it's not going to feed a nutritious human. Crop yield is largely looking at the industrialized sector, continuing what already exists. So the regenerative piece within this is tiny, is the point. This slide doesn't necessarily relate to the point, but it's interesting. A 1% increase in soil organic carbon increases the capacity of soil to hoard a swimming pool's worth per acre. So the increasing of life in the soil piece and what can happen in terms of holding on to water is key. These figures just show the appetite of asset owners or investors to start looking at nature. And those figures, again, are small versus what we're seeing now. I'm not going to bore you with each one of these, but just to give you an idea as to, 1 minute, as to where technology is going that we would deem to be regenerative. Mad Capital give regenerative advice in 52 states in America, set up by an absolute winning double professor called Dr. Phil Taylor, who you should all meet because he's fantastic. But they have a lending platform. They lend to farmers with advice on preferred rates and have really got things moving. Fungal biologicals, they develop bioinputs from fungal strains that are used by big ag and simply replace existing chemicals. So the farmer doesn't even necessarily know. They've just got a more efficient and cheaper product that usually works with nature far better. No fence, this is a whole other world. This is about how do we holistically graze our livestock over a landscape such that we're mimicking the predator-prey relationship, which means how are we intensively grazing, causing an influx of root growth, and then moving off the land for a long enough time that the soil can recover. Mirror work with spectroscopy to help us understand what's in our soil and therefore what's in the nutrient density of the things growing from our soils. And they work very closely with a company that we've just invested in called Audacious, who are probably very useful for today in that they are leading the way in trying to map out what full spectrum nutrient density looks like in meat, dairy, legumes, grains. They work closely with people like Dan Barber in America. You may know Chef Dan Barber. He is trying to build his own institute looking at how taste sits alongside nutrient density and how that nutrient density in terms of the extent of the nutrient density of any type of food leads entirely back to the level of regeneration from the farm that food has come to. So we see Audacious as very much being the Trojan horse for showing big companies that it advises exactly how to improve their farming methods right back on farm to be able to then shout about the nutritional profiling of the products they're trying to sell. So research creates the knowledge, startups build the solution, investment scales the impact. We've got 789 companies in our pipeline who need something like 19 billion in next round required capital. There's us and one other fund in this space who we know extremely well and respect enormously. There should be hundreds of investors. The entire climate community should be looking at this for tomorrow's returns as well as the impact. And I suppose if we had one message to people here today, it would be try where you can to push the investment piece, because a lot can then follow. And at the moment, it's not got a loud enough voice to push it as quickly as we might like. Thank you.